All right, welcome to the World War I Russian Revolution test part 2 review, and today we pick up on number 21. As America gets involved in World War I and Germany starts to kind of run out of soldiers and supplies, because they've been fighting a two-front war for 4 years, they eventually have to give up. And on November 11th, 1918, there is an agreement to stop fighting. It's called an armistice, and for a long time it was called Armistice Day. November 11th was, but today we celebrate Veterans Day on November 11th. So anyway, World War I comes to an end on November 11th, 1918, because an armistice was signed, or an agreement to stop fighting was signed by all parties involved. All right, now that the war's over, the leaders of all the countries, they're going to meet in Paris to go over and create a peace treaty called the Treaty of Versailles. And our president was invited to this meeting, and he wants to show up with, every leader wants to show up with a bunch of ideas. Nobody wants to show up empty-handed and unprepared. So he comes with 14 ideas, and these are his ideas, which he thinks will lead to a lasting world peace after World War I. And he wants to see some, if not all, of these ideas. He wants to see them in the final treaty. So those are his 14 ideas he would like to see in the Treaty of Versailles. And he thinks they will lead to a lasting world peace after World War I. So those 14 points were just our president's treaty. He's not writing our president's ideas. He's not writing the treaty all by himself. We've got friends and allies who have a say-so as well, like Britain and France. And how do they, what do they think of our president's ideas? Well, they've got some different goals than our president does. Britain, France, and our allies, they want to make sure Germany can never invade them again, all right? They want to make sure Germany is going to be punished and Germany is going to be weakened, and that Britain and France are going to be safe, all right? So I guess they liked his ideas okay, but they really didn't agree with most of them. They had other things they wanted to accomplish. Again, like their own safety, they want to punish Germany. So overall, of the 14 ideas, they only allowed one of the 14 ideas in the treaty. So they didn't really agree with our president's ideas. Okay, so they didn't really agree with our president's ideas, except for maybe one or two. They really are focused on their own safety and security, and they really want to punish Germany really badly. Okay, so the treaty, when it's finally written and finished, is going to be called the Treaty of Versailles, and it really, really treats Germany really badly. There's this part in there called the War Guilt Clause. It puts all the blame on Germany, punishes the heck out of Germany. They owe like $31 billion to the rest of the world in reparations. That's just going to ruin their economy. And there's all these other things in the treaty, like their military is shrunken down like tremendously. They lose land. So it just really, really, really hurts Germany and really punishes Germany severely. And that's going to leave the Germans in a really bad spot, and they're really mad, and they're really bitter, and they're really angry, and they really resent the rest of the world for punishing them this severely. So it really hurts Germany, and it leaves the German people angry and bitter at the rest of the world. And that's going to allow a crazy group of people called the Nazis to rise up, and a crazy guy named Hitler, to come along and say, hey, I'll make your life better, and I'll fix this, and I'll fix this, and we'll get back at the rest of the world. So it kind of leads to Hitler's rise to power. Like I mentioned on number 24, there was this part of the Treaty of Versailles called the War Guilt Clause, and that places all blame on Germany, and that's why Germany gets so punished in the Treaty of Versailles. So of Wilson's 14 points, his 14 ideas, only one makes it in the final treaty. It was called, it was his 14th point, which called for this group of nations that would go around and make sure everybody else was behaving and protect the big nations of the world, protect the small nations of the world. And today we have something like that called the United Nations, but back then we didn't. And this was Woodrow Wilson's idea, and it was his 14th idea, and it makes it into the Treaty of Versailles. It's not very successful because, first of all, America decides not to get in it. Our Senate, not our president, but our Senate decides which treaties we sign and which we don't. And even though our president was a big fan of the League of Nations, the Senate did not want to join it. So we end up not joining the League of Nations. And we're probably the most powerful country in the world, or one of them at this point. And with us not in the League of Nations, it really, really makes it not a very strong group. And then secondly, if we're not in it, that means Britain and France are the leaders of it. And you think they're going to go around right now after World War I and stand up to countries misbehaving? No, because what happens when you stand up to a bully? Sometimes you're going to have to fight. And you think Britain and France are willing to risk a fight this soon after World War I? No way. So it's not a success. The League of Nations does not do a good job because we're not in it, and because Britain and France are too afraid at this point to stand up to somebody and really put their foot down and tell a country you can't do that, because they're afraid that would lead to another war. All right, 27 and 28 are map questions, and on 28 you just have to read the map, but on 27 you do need a little bit of a review on one of President Woodrow Wilson's ideas called self-determination. So he was a big believer in allowing people to decide for themselves in what country they want to live. Okay, if you make somebody live in a country or under a government they don't want to live, where they don't want to live, they're going to be bitter and resentful, and that could lead to rebellion, revolution, war. So in hopes of keeping the peace, he was a big proponent of self-determination, which means letting people decide what country they want to live in. So new countries kind of break away from old countries, and that's what causes a lot of these map changes after World War I, self-determination. Okay, number 29. At the end of World War I, Germany and the bad guys, the Central Powers, what usually happens to losers after a war is they lose land. So they are going to lose a fair amount of territory. On the previous questions on the test, 27, 28, you see maps, and you should be able to notice on those maps how the bad guys' territories got smaller. So yeah, they're going to lose territory, and brand new countries are going to appear on the map. Germany really goes through a bad period. They get blamed for the entire war. So Germany is going to go through a bad historical period. Hitler is a young man, and he's going to rise up through the ranks and become the leader of Germany. But yeah, it's just a bad time for Germany. The Central Powers are going to lose land, and new countries are going to emerge. Okay, so this is a question that I probably didn't do a good job of in my lectures, and maybe you didn't even read about it in the book, but it talks about Austria-Hungary in the early 1900s, and it's unique because it's not just Austria or Hungary, it's Austria-Hungary. So you have Austrians there and you have Hungarians there, and those are two different ethnicities. And then you even had more than that. So you had Austrians, Hungarians, then you had Jews, and just many, many, many more ethnicities. So it was a very diverse country, and ethnic diversity can be a good thing. It leads to new ideas and new cultures, but it can also be a challenge because they don't always get along with each other. So that's how Austria-Hungary was different than other countries. It was very, very ethnically diverse, which did lead to some tension in that country. All right, so some Russian Revolution questions. Hopefully you watched my Russian Revolution videos and read the Russian Revolution sections of the textbook. They weren't very long. I broke them up into small sections. A lot of things lead to the end of the Romanov dynasty. It's not just one or two things. There were a lot of things going on. Bloody Sunday was when some Russian citizens were protesting for better living conditions, working conditions, freedoms, and rights. Unarmed protesters in the Russian army opened fire, killing many of them. That was very embarrassing and made the royal family look very, very badly. So that was certainly one event which leads to their downfall. World War I and how the Romanov family got them involved in World War I. And as you know, they got whooped day after day after day. So that was not a very popular war and made the royal family look bad. And then they allowed that crazy dude, Rasputin, to have a lot of influence over the government. That certainly didn't make the Romanov family look very good either. So all of those were some things that led to the Romanov family losing power in Russia. 32 is a similar type question asking, reasons why the Romanov family loses power and eventually communists take over Russia. And so everything in 31 I talked about were causes. 32 adds a few more. Everybody else is so much more advanced, so many more factories, so many more railroads. And then Russia is just, kind of far behind other countries. And when you lag behind other countries, the government, or in this case, the royal family, was an easy target to blame. So the fact that Russia was far behind other countries made the royal family look bad. The fact that Russian citizens didn't get to vote and they didn't have any sort of parliament or Congress type group that would be elected by them and represent them. Every other country nearby was having some of these freedoms and having some of these more modern governments. Russia wasn't, and again, made the royal family look bad. And then shortages of bread and shortages of fuel. Luckily we live in a country where we don't have food shortages, knock on wood. But if you're starving, or if there's a serious shortage of goods like fuel, the government is an easy target to blame for that. So lagging behind Western countries, shortages of food and fuel, an old-fashioned oppressive government where you couldn't elect people. These are all things which got blamed on the royal family and would eventually lead to their overthrow and demise. All right, so Russia is at this point during their right before their revolution in the early 1900s. They're building a lot of factories and they're building a lot of railroads, and they're going through the industrialization process. And as you know, that's a painful thing to go through. Working conditions decline, living conditions get worse for a while, and it's just becoming industrialized is not fun. And during the Industrial Revolution in England is when this guy named Karl Marx came up with his ideas. And during the Industrial Revolution in Russia, a lot of Russians start learning about these ideas of Marx. And one of these groups of people in Russia were called the Bolsheviks. So these are Russians who agree with Karl Marx and who think that the factory owners of Russia are using and exploiting the factory workers of Russia. And they're pretty radical, and they're willing to do radical, violent things. They want to see changes, and they're wanting to see the workers sort of change and overtake the factories. Instead of the factory owners getting rich, the factory workers share the wealth. So these are Russian believers in Karl Marx's ideas, and they're pretty radical and not afraid of doing radical, violent things to achieve their goals. Okay, so you had the Bolsheviks on the last question, the radical, possibly violent believers of Karl Marx in Russia. Then you also had the Mensheviks, and they were a little bit more laid back. They still believed in Karl Marx. They still wanted change. They wanted to help the workers, but they were more moderate, very less radical and violent, and they were willing wait things out and accept gradual change. See, the Mensheviks wanted the Industrial Revolution to fully happen in Russia. The more factories, the more railroads, the worse living conditions you're going to get. The worse pay is going to get, working conditions, living conditions. And if you just let, the Mensheviks believed if you just let Russia become fully industrialized, living conditions would be so bad and working conditions would be so bad that everybody would want change. The Bolsheviks were like, no, we don't need to wait. We can do it now. So Lenin and the Bolsheviks said, even though we're not fully industrialized yet, we should still do the revolution now. We shouldn't wait. It can be successful now. We don't have to wait. So they believed that a communist or socialist revolution could work now. They didn't have to wait for conditions to get worse. So quickly, quick summary of the Russian Revolution. The Romanov family rules for like 300 years. In March of 1917, they get overthrown, and they're going to be replaced with a temporary government that's just going to make decisions for a while until something more permanent takes their place. But that temporary government was not very popular because they stayed in World War I. So these Bolsheviks we've been talking about the last couple of questions, they're going to, because of Lenin's leadership, they get more and more powerful. They're promising things like peace, land, and bread. And when they have the power and the popularity they think they need, they go to that temporary government, overthrow it like Napoleon did in his country, a coup d'etat. So they overthrow the government using force, they arrest the government leaders, and that's how they take over power in Russia. All right, once the Bolsheviks are in charge, they are believers in Karl Marx's ideas, so now they're going to force Karl Marx's communist ideas on Russia. So this is when Russia becomes communist, and in a communist country, what ends up happening is nobody owns anything. The government owns everything. So the government owns all land, all businesses, all factories. The government owns everything. There is no private ownership, and that's what happens in a communist country. All right, so once the Bolsheviks take over the government, they are now in charge. They turn Russia into a communist country. Actually, they changed the name of Russia to the USSR, or the Soviet Union, and they changed their own name. They become the Communist Party, not the Bolshevik Party, the Communist Party. Lenin is going to have a stroke, and he's going to be not able to lead the Communist Party and the Soviet Union anymore. And his replacement is going to be a bad guy with a crazy mustache called Joseph Stalin. Which Stalin wasn't even his real name. It means man of steel. So Joseph, man of steel, Stalin. So Stalin is going to create what is called a totalitarian state. Other people are going to create one in other countries a little bit later. A guy named Mussolini is going to create one in Italy a little bit later. A guy named Adolf Hitler is going to create one in Germany later. North Korea today, I would say, is a totalitarian state. So this is when the government has total, complete control over public life, private life. Like, you have no privacy or own nothing. The government controls everything, public and private life. So Stalin is a crazy madman. He is going to try to get rid of all of his potential political opponents, enemies, anyone who he saw as a threat to him or his government. And it was called the Great Purge. And he is trying to get rid of all of his threats, enemies, political opponents. And it's about a year or two long. And there are estimates that he had between 8 and 13 million people killed during this Great Purge. And last but not least for today, number 40. All right, so Stalin during this time period calls for, orders a command economy, and that's when the government basically says, this factory, you need to start making this, and this factory, you need to start making this, and y'all need to make this much, and y'all need to make this much. It's when the government takes over factories. And it's something that we do in this country occasionally. Like right now, we're sort of doing it. We're telling our factories to make masks and ventilators and things like that. World War II, we did it. We had factories start making bombs and guns and tanks and boats. But typically, we don't do a command economy in America. Factories in America are free and privately owned, so they can make what they want to make. But Stalin wanted to do a command economy in the Soviet Union because he felt that they were still far behind the rest of the world, and he wanted to catch up and catch up fast within like 5 or 10 years. So he's doing this so he can catch up with the Germanys and the Britons and the Americas of the world and get as industrialized and as powerful as they are. So he feels they're way behind and he wants to catch up fast. All right, I hope you are watching this video. It will pretty much ensure that you score very well on this portion of the Russian Revolution and World War I test. All right, we will see you tomorrow. I hope you enjoyed my super cool shirt, one of my favorites. I need to start wearing it back to school when we reconvene, but we won't reconvene until next year, so maybe I'll start wearing it next year. Anyway, we'll see you tomorrow. Take care.